in a race and law minor that I partook as an instructor, and also my own experiences decolonizing my own classroom and the work I had to do to rethink and reteach myself on how can we create a more abolitionist-centered classroom. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment of silence for Black lives lost to police brutality, to COVID, and just to the limited life chances that we experienced in this nation. Okay. And I want to give a bit of background of who I am and my expertise and why this work is important to me before I launch into the content. And so as Trey introduced in my introduction, I'm trained in multiple fields that include Black studies, gender women studies, and sociology. I started my PhD journey in sociology at UC Santa Barbara. And halfway through my program, I transferred to African American Studies with my advisor. And that truly transformed my work and the questions I was asking. And so ultimately my work centers people, people's experiences, how people make meaning with one another, and how that meaning making creates certain life experiences in relationship to the society we are all socialized within and experience in our unique ways, but also shared ways. And so my areas include gender violence, girlhood studies, and intersections of race and law. And in those intersections, I really don't only look at people's biographies and how they create moves and strategies to move through their worlds, but also how our structures mirror some of that behavior and those actions we have in our institutions have its own life, right? That's breathed into how it impacts how we live in this world. And you'll get more about the impact of institutions and how they can orchestrate violences against people, right? Not only people against people. And ultimately, my training informs how I teach and what I teach. So as I mentioned before, I taught in the race and law minor at UC Berkeley, where I taught a class on policing race and gender in America. And so we look at policing more expansively. That includes how neighborhoods are surveilled. It includes how institutions discriminately treat people, including in schooling and hospitals and things like that. And I also teach in Black girlhood studies. I center Black girl life, meaning childhood matters to how we grow up to be adults. And I center my study and engage girls' lives in a dissertation I completed where I worked with and witnessed the lives of Black girls who were enrolled in an alternative school in Northern California. And with my work, I find it really important that it has elements of community engagement. A lot of those times I worked with schools to provide mentorship, resources, opportunities for young people, including sponsoring an international trip to South Africa for one young woman. I also sponsored a girls' night to bring into conversation Black girls at the school who were not getting along well, and they were going through mediation but wasn't working. And so we just had a girls' night where we can just put that all aside and enjoy one another. And that's what we did. And so I believe research is relevant as much as it impacts people's lives. So as I said, I center people, I center how people understand their worlds, and I work to use my own resources I have to uplift, right, their perspectives in ways that often don't get centered in the work that I typically read at the university level. So today's talk, I'll cover three main areas. First, I'll cover the significance of structural racism and what state-sanctioned violence is. These are terms that are emerging quite a bit in mainstream conversation and social media, and it has a historical basis that's really important for us to understand this current moment, right? And this current moment didn't come out of nowhere, right? And through that understanding of state-sanctioned violence, I'll also talk about where intersectionality came from as really a legal framework that highlighted the discrepancy in how legal protections were distributed to different people and left some people out of those protections. And those people that were highlighted were Black women in the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. And then I'll end with what is abolition, right? And why is it important that we understand its meaning and can use it as a daily practice in our work and in our interactions with one another? Does that sound good? If you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I'm a talker, so I'll just keep going. I'm gonna try to keep it short enough where we can have a discussion, because I really would love to hear what you all think of what I discussed and your own questions and commentary. Let's see, okay. So state-sanctioned violence. This term is informed by the founding of this nation. And this nation is founded upon three main documents that, if you've been educated in the US school system, you have learned about: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. These documents are supposed to be the breath of freedom and liberty, and they're supposed to protect all citizens, actually all civilians that reside in this nation. And I'll talk about what each one is and their significance to the founding of this country. And I'll talk about the ways in which how Black people specifically were left out as a protected class under these three supposed liberatory documents. So you have the Declaration of Independence, adopted in 1776. The principal drafter is Thomas Jefferson. And this was the document that justified the 13 colonies' break from Great Britain to engage in a war and to declare their independence. Then the Constitution came about as our federal government. This was the doctrine that informed our three branches of government, including the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. And it states also the important division of power between states and federal government, so that our federal government wouldn't have too much power where states couldn't make their own decision-making in the benefits of their own civilians. And so that led to the creation of the Bill of Rights in 1789, which are 10 amendments, and it's supposed to guarantee individuals certain basic rights as citizens. And it's supposed to limit the power of the federal government. And so, as I said before, the Declaration was designed to justify a break away from the government, and has never been amended because it's more the ideology and the breadth behind the Constitution and the eventual creation of the Bill of Rights. The Constitution and Bill of Rights created or established a government in this country, and it was designed to create both an energetic government to empower the central government to preserve the blessings of liberty and freedom, but it also constrained its power through the adoption of the Bill of Rights that limited the federal government's ability and capacity, and really reflected a fear of an overly centralized government to impose its will on people of the states. So ideally, all of these documents were supposed to centralize freedom, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? But the piece that you don't get in our Eurocentric curriculum is, simultaneously, as these documents were foregrounded, there were other documents that undermined the liberties and freedoms of Black people in this country. One of those being the slave codes. So slave codes were actually created, drafted, and ratified before the Declaration. And slave codes were defined as state laws that codify the status of those enslaved and the rights of slave owners. So essentially, it legalized slavery, and it limited severely the movement of those who were enslaved. And those limitations include the prohibition of reading and writing, gathering without supervision under a white person, land owning white person, and growing foods even. There were punitive and brutal punishments for these acts that were committed by those who were enslaved if they disobeyed any of these codes. And the ways in which slave codes were enforced were through the slave patrols. And researchers now are saying that our criminal legal system was established through the doctrine of slave codes and serve as a, quote, precursor to the modern American system of policing. So it's to police Black life and Black bodies versus to protect Black life, right? And so slave patrols were created to protect white land-owning families and legitimize slave codes. These patrols came before a modern day policing. Slave patrols were typically white men and women from low ranks of white society, but they were also plantation owners or other high status people who wanted to avoid military service. South Carolina was one of the first states to create slave patrols in 1740 to ensure that these prohibitions were surveilled and criminalized of those who were enslaved and who went against these prohibitions. And so this contributes and is important to understand the legacy of what racial violence and racial discrimination looks like today. So when the founding principles of our nation are based upon the limitation and respect of Black life, that then has historical ramifications. And so it's through that history that when slavery was eventually abolished, it's a capacity to humanize Black people was very limited. And so we have the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is supposed to ban slavery and involuntary servitude. The 14th Amendment articulates all persons born or naturalized in the United States were considered US American citizens and provided equal protection. And the 15th Amendment prohibited states from voter disenfranchisement with a provision to institute voter qualifications. And I would like to say, right, these legal amendments articulating its supposed respect for life is really an impossibility. And even though in this talk, I don't talk about colonialism, imperialism, and the genocide of indigenous groups, that also foregrounded, right? The lack of sanctity and respect towards life outside of a white body. So I do want to say that that is also an important history to understand. I do have literature by scholars who do phenomenal work around that work around colonialism and imperialism and genocide in this nation. But for now, look at the Civil War amendments that were supposed to legalize the rights and liberties of Black people pretty much fell short. And part of the reason why they fell short was because when there was an attempted way to remedy, right, the violence of the slave codes through the Freedmen's Bureau to heal from slavery, this was limited in their power. So the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to assist formerly enslaved people and poor whites in the South and provide housing, food, medical aid, and to establish schools and offer legal assistance, and to really remedy the harms that were done under the slaveocracy. However, the Freedmen's Bureau, during the time that it was operating, it was severely understaffed and underfunded. And in fact, it was short-lived, where it was dismantled in the summer of 1872 under the pressure of white Southerners who didn't find it fair that there was special treatment, even though this isn't special treatment when you've been dehumanized by a system, right, for centuries. And so at this point, you see that there's this legal rectification, an attempt, right, to bring about humanizing legal rights through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and through the Freedmen's Bureau. But we see their limitations in application because, again, this is federal. I remember states have their own set of legislation. And because states have their own set of legislation, Black codes usurped the efficacy, right, or the efficiency of those amendments. And the Black codes were ratified in 1865 at the same time as the 13th Amendment, where the 13th Amendment was supposed to ban slavery and involuntary servitude, but Black codes at the state level sustained its creation and sustained involuntary servitude and sustained dynamics of slavery through restrictive laws that were codified after the emancipation of slavery to continue to limit the economic opportunities for Black people as cheap labor. And some of the code types included vagrancy, basically pressures free Black folks to sign contracts to hard labor who were unemployed, peddlers, gamblers, folks who were seen on the street that they weren't working. They then were forced into these contracts of servitude once again. You also had labor contracts where Black servants who worked for white masters were mandated to work under. That's a sharecropping system where you're still doing the work as if you're enslaved, but you get maybe paid a cent versus when you were enslaved, you had no money. So it's still a type, right, of servitude. And then the final code that is of interest is apprenticeships, where Black orphans or children without parents were mandated to serve under white employers until the age of 21 years of age. So you have vulnerable children on the street, and instead of providing housing and resource and access, instead you catapult them into servitude in white homes. And so Black codes were functioning simultaneously as those Civil War amendments were being ratified. And so the states that primarily encoded these Black codes were in the South, and Mississippi and South Carolina were the first states to ratify these codes in late 1865. And so it's important to understand this language. So when we're trying to appeal for legal rights, right, they can be easily undermined by other forms of legislation at the state level. And so what you see was, because you had the institutionalization and ratification of Black codes at the state level, you also then created, right, the system of Jim/Jane Crow between 1877 and 1968. And we've all heard about what Jim Crow is. It's a legally enforced and binding system of racial segregation and mandated segregated schools, parks, water fountains, libraries, cemeteries, restrooms. Every public and private place was separated, right? And these were adopted after the dismantling of Reconstruction, or the Freedmen's Bureau that I discussed. And they still emerged when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were ratified. Again, states used the Bill of Rights to justify the institutionalization and legalization of Jim and Jane Crow. And because of this, important cases like Plessy versus Ferguson argued the separate but equal clause, that it was okay that we were in segregated spaces as long as it was equal, but we all knew it was never equal nor intended to be equal. So once again, the rights of Black people in this nation were undermined systematically through legal discourse and ratification. And what this led to, because of the lack of protection, is the emergence of intimidation, violence, and lynchings in this country. And so the work of Brian Stevenson, he is a legal scholar, advocate, and educator, and who founded the Equal Justice Initiative, where he documented, and his team, more than 4,400 racial terror lynchings in 12 Southern states. And he was the person who coined the term racial terror lynchings, because a lynching wasn't just an individual act. Lynchings were justified and legitimated by court systems and by legal professionals when they would happen. So it's important to know these are acts of terror, because Black folk were the target, right? And to create a justification that their harm was legitimated through the eyes of the state. And it's also interesting on this map that you can see a lot of these lynchings occurred in the Midwest. And we found actually more lynchings occurred in the Midwest than even the South, right? And so it's important that we understand these acts of torture, right, and terror were not documented. So when we even look at white violence or white crime, the reason why the numbers are low is because that violent action wasn't seen as a criminal act. It was justified as a way to protect the status quo of the society, to continue to bar Black people from the protections of the state and their legitimacy to their life. And so in this part of the presentation, I'm talking about how our system of government legalized violence, legalized exclusion, and legalized discrimination. And so when you saw in the 1960s and 70s, the end of de jure segregation, or the legalization of segregation, like through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that ended segregation in public spaces, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that outlawed discriminatory voting practices, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination in regard to the sale, rental, and financing houses. Even though these federal acts were instituted to desegregate this country and to supposedly create a safer, right, and more equal nation, what happened was, even though de jure segregation ended legally, it still manifested in our legal system. And we still see the ramifications of that history of exclusion and violence and harm, and how we now are contemporarily seeing the world. And you think about police brutality and you see the video documentation of Black life lost on camera, and that this country's legal system can protect that, is why it's so important that we understand this history, because the system is working. As a legal scholar, Paul Butler, stated. So when we see these injustices, they're not injustices actually. they're justified by our legal system because of this history of state sanctioned violence through the adoption and ratification of laws that disregarded Black life. And so I transitioned this conversation from that legal history to talk about why the work of Kimberly Crenshaw is so important in intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term that is becoming popularized not only in news media and social media, but Black Lives Matter and movements. And people now are really instilling this idea of intersectionality to understand people's different identities in regards to sex, gender, sexuality, religion, where you live. All those intersectional identities you hold impacts how you live in this world and impacts how you perceive the world and how the world perceives you. So it's an important term to understand, but it's also important to understand this term is not only about the individual, it's about how the individual is seen and treated within a system. And so Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term. Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, and she wrote this piece talking about intersectionality in 1989, not too long ago. And it was informed by Black feminist scholars, including Angela Davis, Ann Julia Cooper, Sojourner Truth, Patricia Williams, Bell Hooks, legal scholars, activists, grassroots efforts to show why it's important that we have to disrupt the single praxis framework that oftentimes distorts the experiences of mostly marginalized people. What does that mean? It means you just don't see people by their race solely and through the story of one person's racial story. And so she was talking about how Black women were left out of anti-discrimination cases, how their issues and their cases that they were waging, that they were fighting for to rectify the discrimination they faced, wasn't understood or seen in the legal system, partially because the numbers weren't there. So when they want to make claims of sexism, their experience didn't mirror white women, right? When they wanted to file a racist claim, right? Their experiences didn't mirror Black men. And so because our legal system is single dimensional, you leave out then how people can experience discrimination differently. And that's why her work is so important. And the quote I include here, anti-discrimination does not accurately reflect the interaction of race and gender, was well articulated in her article in 1989. And she really called to question movements like the feminist movement that try to universalize the voice of women, and it disregarded the impact of race and gender that oftentimes obscure their experiences in the legal form. So once again, even in anti-discrimination cases that are supposed to rectify harm or fix the harm that happened, your harm isn't even seen. And so because of this, it is important that we look at how our institutions then embody state-sanctioned violence, how they also create a violent environment for people to move through. And so the work of Nikki Jones and the Chosen Ones, where she looked at how an older man was re-entering back into his community after being incarcerated, wanted to change the lives of Black men and Black families in his community, and the feedback he received by the credential class of even Black folk who just say, you can't make those kind of changes because you don't have the right credential. And so in her work, she problematizes the impact of how we have to see inclusively what change can mean. And for someone who's re-entering the community out of a system that is so dehumanizing, like the prison system, coming back to make a change, it's not easy. Right? And because we don't think about how these systems are violent in and of themselves. And so in her work, she thinks through, how does violence move through our bodies? How does violence then shape our encounters with each other? And so what she found was when we look at police violence and street harassment, they reveal a shared vulnerability to dominance and violence. Both forms of violence are gendered violence. And so in the example in her book, she shows this young woman who was handcuffed by 2 police officers and young Black men who are watching her saying, oh, I would love to be locked up with her, making all of these inappropriate comments to her. But those young men themselves have recently gone through a cavity check with the police, degraded publicly, right? Because that is a bodily check where you're exposed. And so you see that violence that they experienced at the hands of police. Then they impose that violence on this young woman who is about to go to jail. And so you see how violence moves through our speech with one another, how it moves through our encounters, because our systems are violently treating us. And so when we look at gendered violence, and it's not just looking at women and girls or non-binary bodies, trans bodies, it's everyone. All of our bodies are being violently pushed through the system, and then we are left to work and love one another when the environment is so harmful, because our country does not seek to make sure our lives are honored, are respected, and that we are equitably treated. And so this creates vulnerability. And so when we look at intersectionality of our different identities and how they relate to state systems like our legal system, it's also important to see how we also have intersectional vulnerabilities. And so when we look at our vulnerabilities, which we all have because we're human beings, it allows us to disrupt how we're looking at race, gender, and crime. It moves the onus and the responsibility from individuals, from saying, okay, you committed this crime, you have to meet this sentence. And instead it's looking at how violence and vulnerability comes from the state, comes from these supposed legal protections. And then we have to really inquire around what's the intersections of race, gender, and justice. What is justice when our system is unjust? What is justice when we're making claims to honor Black life to a legal system that has shown it cannot? Right? And so when you look at intersectional vulnerabilities, you then start thinking about, oh, maybe it's just not me. Maybe it's just not my community, right? Maybe it's how we are structured in society. And we encourage this critical look. And an excerpt I took from the article me and Nikki Jones wrote together, we encourage feminist scholars to examine the relationship between interpersonal violence and institutional violence, as well as the feminist movement's relationship to the state. And at times when we think about the feminist movement and the ways in which that movement depended on the state to incarcerate perpetrators of violence, that also was wrapped into racialized logics as well. And so when we look at remedies of healing through these violent institutions, we cannot have justice, right? And so the reason why I introduced intersectional vulnerabilities to the conversation is because I want us to shift into a conversation around abolition, and why abolition is not an impossibility. It is not a pie in the sky dream. It is required for us in order to have the humanities of everyone be honored, respected, and embraced. And so in this last section of this discussion, I want to include the definition of what abolition is from an abolitionist scholar, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and talk about what does abolition mean, not only as a structural kind of upheaval, but also an upheaval of our daily practices that we have control over. So this is the big paragraph, so I'll read it through for you all, but and I'll highlight the main takeaway. But Ruth Wilson Gilmore articulates the following: abolitionists have brought to the struggle against what came to be called mass incarceration an array of experiences in which we learn how to fight on many fronts at once, how to organize, promote ideas, and bargain in the political arena. In other words, we work the entire ecology of precarious existence that shapes but is not bounded by the aggrandizing criminal justice system, including housing, jobs, education, income, faith, environment, status. Far from being starry-eyed idealists, we are specialists in the daily grind of the deliberate, patient, and persistent work necessary for what we want: freedom and justice. And so I chose this quote because, first off, Wilson starts with how mass incarceration was the initial conversation we've been having around abolition, right? Defunding the police, abolishing the police on campuses and in neighborhoods, right? And with an abolitionist framework, it's the understanding that these institutions cannot be reformed. They have to be upended and uprooted. But the second piece of abolition is it's not just our criminal legal system, because our criminal legal system is so connected to our school system, our medical system, our housing system, our in-home care system, all these systems. So we have to think abolition in regards to all these institutions we're moving through, because in order to have an abolitionist society, that means we are critically engaging all the institutions we move through, and we're engaging them through a transformative lens, not through reformation, because to reform means something's going right, and nothing's going right institutionally. But it's not to say that we can't support those who are still caught up in the system. It's still important to create life-changing, right, laws and legislation to protect those who are in the system, but we still have our eyes on the prize to eventually abolish these systems. And so it's a complex system, abolition, because it calls for the century of freedom and justice. And as Toni Cade Bambara, an artist and creative, or a late artist and creative, she said, you know, freedom is an achievement within the system, but to be free is a practice in your daily life. And so today I want to think about abolition as that practice of being free in our daily lives, in our conversations, in our encounters, in your Decolonizing Classroom series. This is where abolitionist thinking begins. And so I want to use my class I taught in this past summer as a case study of what abolition meant in my classroom. And so, as I mentioned, I taught a class in the race and law minor. And this past summer, I taught it the day after George Floyd was murdered. And I actually didn't know George Floyd was murdered when I started the first class, because it was later in the evening and I hadn't seen the news because I taught early the next morning. And when that happened, I had to pause as an instructor, because before this, when COVID overtook the world, the university swiftly created resources, said turn to virtual learning, gave talks, gave time, gave access. They said, you know what, do what you need to do to honor students where they're at and however we can help. But when George Floyd was murdered, and this is after Breonna Taylor, like a series of murders, right, happened, no discussion about change. And I felt like, as someone who's teaching in race and law, I had to change how I taught this information. So I had to transform the syllabus, which is normally a record of readings and assignments, to share and expect students to achieve, right, throughout their time in the course. I changed it to be a commitment, not only to them, but to myself, to dismantle white suprematic logics of surveillance and criminalization that is encoded in attendance and assignments. My training, I'm supposed to surveil students through attendance and count the number of times they showed up to show whether or not they were an A student. You have to create rigorous assignments for students to show their capacity to be rigorous learners and thinkers. And I thought about how arbitrary that was and how much violence that does to students generally, but particularly now. So I literally took the week off of my students, and it was only a 6-week course. So like the second week, we just sat in our virtual meetings together. You didn't have to come, but I took that time to tell them attendance is not required. If you can make the virtual session, write me a summary off the reads. If you cannot do that, articulate the time frame that you need. Because at this point, we are all vulnerable. We are exhausted. We are enraged. We are upset. And I'm like, I want you all to take time to think through not only this course material, but how it relates to your lives. So in this course, I centered this idea of dissension is not disrespect. Because there were many moments, we had very uncomfortable conversations where students in the chat would say, well, this person is being vulnerable. We shouldn't say the other side of things. We should respect their vulnerability. And I made clear to students, we're all uncomfortable. But it's important that we have these uncomfortable discussions, because uncomfortable discussions will then inform, right, intentional action. And it will allow us to understand the different ways we're understanding these systems of violence in a more humanistic way. And so in that class, I had students really unlearn and unpack certain granted privileges they had. I had students who came from all kinds of backgrounds. Some students who had great homes for studying and others who did not. And so I told them, you are not going to be treated equally in this class. You will be treated in equity, meaning when you have issues, let me know. Some of my students got COVID. Some of my students were being evicted. Some of my students didn't have internet. And so for me, I couldn't have the same expectations. And so to create an equitable classroom was to create more compassion in the rigor expected. And through this class, I had them shift from a group project to create a state proposal to remedy vulnerabilities that were exacerbated under COVID, to being an opportunity to document their vantage point. A 3-part assignment where I had students think about their own capacity building to uplift daily practices to mitigate harm waged against Black life and those who live vulnerably on the sidelines. And to do this 3-part assignment, students had to interrogate their own vulnerabilities, their own privileges, how they encountered institutions, and what they could do to change and impact Black life. And so that meant for some students who were academic senators at the university level, they changed some of their practices and encoded legislation to better protect Black, Brown, and Native and marginalized students on the campus. Other students switched up their reading practice. One student said, I only read white authors. I shifted to Black authors. Wow, that added a layer of complexity I never knew. So I realized students had to differently build their capacity to think about the world differently and continue that work. And I told them it doesn't end in this course. And at the end of the course, the type of work my students completed has been the best I've ever seen. And I had 57 students virtually. And that was the most, I would say, intimate, community-built classroom I've ever witnessed and experienced. And I thought I had experienced that in other classrooms, and we did some of that. But I think in this classroom, because I centered compassion, commitment, love, and rigor at its core to honor all of our humanities, they were able to show up and do phenomenal work that was very it was intellectual, but also vulnerable and also forward thinking. And so I end today's discussion just by saying that through my understanding of state sanctioned violence, understanding that this nation was premised upon the depreciation and disrespect towards Black life, informs why terms and concepts like intersectionality are built from lived experiences through how that exclusion and violence continues even today, when we supposedly got rid of all of those racially segregated codes. But to say that we need to think through abolition, reform is not enough. And abolition is not only the upheaval of these systems, but the upheaval of our daily practices. And it begins in our day-to-day, and it begins in how we make choices, and how we talk to one another, how we work with one another, and how we show up with one another. And so ultimately, I hope today you all can be reflective of what it means to build practices to transform violent systems in your own lives. That was a lot, but thank you so much for listening this evening.
Wow. Can we start with just like a virtual round of applause? That was a lot, but it was phenomenal. I've learned a lot.
Thank you.
I mean, right now, I think we can open this up to a discussion. I know there's some questions that were in the chat. I would love to open it up to whoever does have a question. You can unmute yourself, ask. We can do either of those. I think Carter, you might have had a question earlier if you want to ask.
Yeah, sorry. What is the difference between Jim and Jane Crow?
Yes, thank you for your question. So Jim Crow was like the term that was used to describe racially segregated spaces in the South. And Jane Crow was introduced to talk about the unique experiences that girls and women experience under the system. And so I think it was just a way to expansively think about how these systems of violence impact one another, and really trouble that we can't only look at Black men and Black boys, but also Black girls, Black women, and also non-binary, trans people. It just expanded the conversation to include more people and their experiences under this shared system of violence. Thank you for that question, Carter. Enjoy, your hands raised.
Yes, thank you for an amazing presentation. I was wondering if you could recommend a book, author on restorative and transformative justice. I'm really wanting to, of course, delve deeper into that because just learning more on how we can really begin to abolish and dismantle. So if you could recommend any particular books that you really love, that would be wonderful.
Yes, thank you. Oh, I have to think for a moment because which one comes to mind that I love?
And if you want to just message all of us later that you want to go through, that's okay too.
Yes, absolutely. So I think I'm thinking more about authors, so less of their text. So I think Ruth Wilson Gilmore is one who I really enjoy her work. So she speaks a lot about abolition. So she has interviews on NPR, Democracy Now! That elucidate and clearly state why abolition is so important in ways that I just gleaned a lot of knowledge from. She's also publishing her book on abolition in February. So you can look into that. Angela Davis, this smaller book, it's, here it is. I would say her book, Abolition Democracy, it's a set of interviews she had with another scholar about why abolition impacted her life as someone who was seen as an FBI most wanted person because she was targeted as a communist by this nation. And I just love how her succinct description of abolition and how she tied in the history of slavery, of Jim Crow, but also racial capitalism. She really critiques the political economy in ways that are so important. And so we can't think about racial justice without really thinking about how we spend our money, where we put our money to. And so I love this as well. And I plan to send Trey a list of resources tomorrow with different works that you all can look at. Also Miriam Kaba and her work with Project NIA is so important as well. And that started in schools, and she's just kind of resurrected that as a critique of the Chicago police and police in general. And she's just a powerhouse. So those are the folks who come to mind instantly. But yes, thank you for your question. I'll definitely share out resources that I look to for specific practices of abolition and just transformation. Other folks? It can just be even just comments and talking about your own work and how you're thinking.
Yeah, I think we could even like go around and share something we learned as something short, just so we hear different takeaways from each other. I had one question real quick. Towards the end, you talked about how all of the violence of a system that we're in, we almost inevitably like internalize that and reproduce that in our own communities. And so I was really interested how you're talking about almost like decolonizing or like what's the word, detoxing ourselves of that like violence that we inherit from the system we're in. And you gave a perfect example of like you being a teacher, you changed the way that you teach the class to not perpetrate this like white supremacist society that we're in. So I was wondering if there's like other examples like of us just in our daily lives, in our daily interactions that we can try to not not reproduce like a white supremacist society in our like everyday actions. That might
Yeah.
be yeah. Anything have around that?
No, thank you for your question. Think about everyday things. I'm at a conversation with students about what we read, down to like the stories we share with young children, to our nieces, our nephews, our young people, of like, you know, Huck Finn, Disney. I mean, these are racialized tropes that are not critiqued and is reduced to just innocent play. And I think we can interrogate play as how that's the type of violence of like how you encounter people and what you see in videos and movies and going uncritiqued. Our kids are learning without discussion. And I see it in my nephew who can go on YouTube at age 4 and can consume whatever. And we're not talking about the content. It's like when you pull out a gun on someone, that's dangerous. Here is why. Versus he's like, oh, but it's for play, because at the end of it, someone gets up and laughs it off, when that doesn't happen, especially being a young Black boy. And so I think it can start with how you engage your siblings, and young people, even with the food you eat. Think about, where did this food come from? And purchasing in ways that can provide resources to your community. So finding your local farmers markets, supporting local business, right? You know where your food's coming from in that way. So it's just interrogating different practices around what we eat, what we buy. Like, why do I want to buy that shirt from that designer who supports Donald Trump? Maybe I could buy from somewhere else. So it's those type of interactions that I can think of, and just get off autopilot. You know, we can just move through and just be more intentional about our actions and just not presume we have to do it that way. And COVID has uprooted us all to be more inquisitive of our everyday. So I would just say, looking at your everyday actions and language, and just think about, do I mean those words? Do I mean these actions? And what are the consequences that they could have? That's a great start. And thank you for your question, Trey.
Yeah, thank you for your answer.
I don't really have any questions, but I guess I just had sort of 2 comments. I really liked how you framed, you know, when you were thinking about ways that you can kind of upend oppressive institutions, like in your classroom, in creating an equitable classroom environment instead of just an equal one. I think that in that, and in like abolition, there's also a lot of reframing things and creating new things. There's also a lot of like disability justice in that. Which I've been thinking a lot about in my studies so far, especially just with kind of police and prison and criminal legal justice system abolition. And then I also just really loved one thing that was new to me was just you framing, you know, intersecting identities and how we can perpetuate sort of institutional violence within ourselves and communities, and the idea of intersecting vulnerabilities. That was just really powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for bringing up disability studies, and those encounters are so important. And people who I'm sure you know about, Subini Anima, does like wonderful work around that, and it's so important. And also how disabilities is really about just a violence of being different and like, why is it seen as always bad and worthy of criminalization? So thank you for bringing that up. And I see a couple people have their hands up. I don't know how we're doing on time, but I think
Kirsten had her hand up.
Yeah. Sorry about that, Kirsten.
Oh, no worries. Thank you for all of this. It's really great. One area that we struggle with a lot, but one in particular that I would love to get your feedback on is when we're working with city government in particular. So often decisions are made by majority, and they are made not only majority of the city council, but they then make decisions based on what the majority of the population. And that is such a white supremacist stance and ways of doing things. Do you have models or suggestions on ways to introduce to city councils and other places on more equitable ways of making decisions?
Yeah, thank you for your question, particularly when you're working with these state agencies and governments. I would say Stacey Abrams. She has her new book, Leading from the Outside. And I mean, she got a whole race stolen from her in her
Right,
right for her governorship. And so she talks about leading from the outside, moving outside the boundaries of those cities and engaging a community force, bringing them and forcing them, right, to consider folks who are left out just because they're not part of the majority. So I would say reading her work can really be helpful. And I'm currently reading her book, and it's really powerful because I also feel that way about the university. I'm just like, this is a terrible history, but I'm also like, but how can I think more transformatively, you know, about how I can move beyond what they're telling me I can and cannot do. So I would say look to her for that work. And Eliana,
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question.
No, I had the exact same question, so that's actually great.
Okay, great. And other folks?
Yeah, it's 5 o'clock. I'll leave a few minutes for anybody else who has fleeting remarks, questions.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining this call. I can stay on for the next 10 minutes if you like. Feel free. If not, it was great meeting you and seeing you, and thank you for just listening to this work. I will send Trey a list of resources to share out with you all as well. And the slides, I can make them into a PDF. So if you want to look at them in the future.
Sweet. So right before we close, we just wanted to share one more opportunity to engage with ECC. For the month of November, we're actually hosting a fundraiser for the Abundance of Hope, which is a homeless prevention center that provides comprehensive, culturally relevant homelessness resources for individuals in Seattle. I'll send the link to the fundraiser in the chat right now. A few notes about kind of the art. It was designed by a local artist activist in Seattle. She worked with us while we were protesting over the summer. So if you want to get yourself some really cool merchandise that's limited availability and designed by someone in our own community, definitely check out the fundraiser. If there's no more questions, comments, or concerns, if you have something to ask Kenley, you guys can stay after, but I think we can call this class session over. It's 5:02. Thank you guys for coming, and hopefully we'll see you guys in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. So wonderful.
Yeah.
Sure. Take care, you guys.
Bye.
Bye, Joy.
Well, are you really going to stay,
Yeah,
Kenley?
yeah.
Well, no, if Trey and Alia, if you want to leave, that's okay.
Yeah, I don't want to pressure folks.
Yeah, it's okay.
Right.
But no, I really appreciate it. And I mean, I could probably talk to you for, but I look forward to hearing your resources, but thank you.
And I can share